My name's Paul Masterman. I'm hosting the session today. I think that mainly means that I nod intelligently in all the right places, particularly when Lloyd, Amelia, and John Paul are talking. Um, this webinar, seriously, is part of a series of events and conferences and webinars that I know and I've been partly involved in one or two of them that have been putting on over the last year or two during the pandemic. Do you remember that? The pandemic? That was a couple of interesting 2 years. And I think it's part of Can Digital's approach to um, just introducing new ideas, new thinking, innovations, new products into the community. I joked earlier for free, but I think that's important. It's part of Can Digital giving back to an important community, particularly in local government. The subject today it perhaps doesn't come as a big surprise, but I think what you'll find as a surprise is the take that our colleagues at Can have got on this issue. But the subject today is the climate crisis, is carbon reduction, but with a twist. And we'll come to the twist in a second. Now that we're out of COVID to a certain extent, and we're getting back to whatever we might call normal now. I've been literally hitting the road, talking to various local government communication colleagues around the country, and just trying to sense from them what they think are, despite the issues around recovering from the pandemic, what in the future do they see now, in a few months' time, and in a few years' time, and decades' time, the two or three big issues. One of them they mentioned is levelling up, which has now become a bit of a cliche phrase. Whatever levelling up means, people see that as one of their major challenges over the next few months or so. And the second one is carbon reduction. And that is every organisation in local government I'm talking to at the moment. And no doubt everybody on this call has in some shape or form a carbon reduction campaign or work or media work or whatever it might be high up on their to-do list, and particularly politically with members in councillors in councils pushing that hard from all parties over the next few months and years. So we're all going to be doing campaigns of some sort around carbon reduction and net zero, whether it's awareness raising or behaviour change or whatever it might be. But have we ever thought what the cost of communicating about carbon reduction is? Have we actually thought of the cost of the campaigns that we're running in the context of the impact of those campaigns on carbon reduction? How can we claim to be net zero if in the very act of campaigning we are literally costing the earth?
Problems as Stirling and Falkirk reported. The government is to hold a second
Can you just hear that? Did you? Ah, right. Okay. So I'll just say that again. How can we claim to be net zero when the actual act of campaigning around net zero could potentially be costing a significant amount to the future of this earth? Now, I hadn't thought about this. I mean, I've had a couple of briefs from, particularly from Lloyd and John Paul over the last few days, and my jaw hit the desk because I'd never thought about that. I thought about all the other stuff and read the right books and watched the documentaries, but actually identifying the cost of campaigning and communicating as an issue is new to me. Luckily, it's new to me. It's not quite so new to our colleagues from Can, who good people that they are actually doing a lot of work in this area, and this is why we're going to benefit from their insights over the next 40 minutes or so. I think the important thing to say about this is probably during the next hour or so, we're going to be posing quite a lot of challenging questions and identifying some early issues. This is about starting a conversation rather than you're going to get, 75 slide PowerPoint presentation about how to do it next time you start campaigning around carbon. That there are going to be some practical there's practical stuff going to come on out of today's session, but really you should feel quite excited that you're actually at the ground floor of some challenging innovative thinking about this whole issue. So Lloyd Clark and his colleague Emilia Clark are going to take you through some of the background, the research, and the context of the thinking that they've been doing in recent times. And then John Paul Danon, again from Cannes, will be doing some work with us, just suggesting some real world steps and next steps around this whole issue, and how you as local government communicators and other areas that you represent can start thinking about this and start planning for it and start taking some immediate action. So I'll shut up soon, but as I said, this is a chance to take part in a conversation, which I think is often an unusual situation. We're so busy doing stuff that we rarely take about an hour out of our time just to think about things together, and I think that's the real opportunity. I'll reserve the right during the next few minutes to challenge and ask questions as our speakers outline their thoughts. There is the normal comment chat area for you to make comments as we go through. I'll monitor those and to ask questions, but there will be a sort of more formal Q&A section towards the end of our session. Just to warn you, if you didn't realise already, that we are recording this, as I alluded to at the beginning of the conversation. So do what you need to do if you feel you don't want to be part of that. The other thing is that we want to finish before 1 if we can, but don't rush off unless you have to, because Jean Paul's got a little sort of tasty extra thing to dazzle us with that he and his colleagues have been working on. So only 5 or 10 minutes more. But it's like when you go and watch sort of Avengers universe or whatever, Marvel universe, you wait through all the sort of hours of credits with all that special effects, but at the end there's a little sort of teaser for the next film or whatever it might be. So hang on for that if you do nothing else. So I want to hand over initially to Lloyd and Emilia, who, as I said, are going to take us through thinking and some research, etc. Those of you who know will know that Lloyd is managing director of Cannes Digital, which he launched with others in, I think it was 2014. It seems like you've been around for about 57 years as a company, but actually you're still relatively in your adolescence in that sense. Lloyd's been involved in a lot of work around supporting local government and improving the public services, etc. So if I can use the word passion, this late in the week, just before a weekend, I know from speaking to Lloyd how passionate he is about getting these things right for the health of the sector and also for the benefit of local communities. Emilia, who I've only met for the first time today, so welcome, Emilia. She was described to me as eclectic, whatever that might mean. I aspire to be eclectic. I just want to try and be good at one thing, let alone 12 things. But I know that Emilia is really interested in issues around sustainability as it affects her company and her clients, and social value, and also runs her own production company as well. So I'm sure, Emilia, you're living and breathing in the real world, the issues that you and Lloyd are about to take us through. So over to you.
Thanks very much for that, Paul. It is, I think, Emilia, it is interesting that Paul, in discussions with councils, is hearing sustainability and the environment more broadly as critical, as a top issue that's going to be dealt with. And what we're going to talk today about is really going back to square one with it, about emissions, what they are, how you measure them, what's important, what all this means. And I think we can assume that most people who are listening in today and watching this won't have the responsibility to figure out how much carbon is produced across a council or across an organization, or won't have the responsibility to figure out the grand strategy for how that's going to be reduced or offset as required. But in all of our worlds, we do have direct control over what we do, the carbon that we emit, choices that we make, and understanding the context to that of how this is put together, how it's measured, what all of this means. We're going to be hearing a lot about these concepts as we go forward, as we get more and more into this. I think it's really important. So our conversation is kind of setting that scene of giving that groundwork so that people, when they hear this, when they're understanding it, when they are making decisions, will have that context to be able to make those decisions in the best way. So kind of that as a starting point for what we're going to talk about. So help me out. What is net zero? Let's start there at that basis. What is this concept of net zero?
Yeah, you're right. The sustainability and our impact on the environment it is already, and it's going to become more and more of a daily topic in conversation, right? It's a really important thing to consider in all walks of life. And this concept of net zero is really central to our ability to mitigate our impact on the environment. Obviously, you've seen plenty of images of sad polar bears on an ice cap melting somewhere, and that really links into this concept. So one of the main issues with the fact that we're emitting so many greenhouse gases into the atmosphere is that greenhouse gases have a cumulative effect on global warming. So in order to stop or to mitigate our effect on the environment, in order to try to keep ourselves as 1.5 degree of warming, which we think is going to be quote unquote safe, we need to completely zero out what we're putting into the atmosphere because of this cumulative effect. So the idea behind net zero is that A, you reduce your emissions, so you reduce what you're putting into the environment, and B, you mitigate anything that you continue to put into the environment by removing an equivalent amount of greenhouse gases. So the idea there is to net zero, to zero out your impact, and therefore hopefully to stop adding to this effect of global warming.
Yeah, okay, I've got you. So we've got the two sides of it, the what we produce and where we can't deal with it, what we then offset. I'm guessing that one side is a hell of a lot more important than the other side. And I think that a lot of conversation is about offsetting and what we do on that. But really what we want to focus on is not producing the carbon in the first place. Isn't that right?
Exactly. So we as a world, we have actually developed quite a lot of technology which mitigates your carbon production. You can buy an electric vehicle, you can take more sustainable modes of transport, you can use renewable electricity in your home, but we haven't really come up with a way of taking carbon out of the atmosphere that isn't really based on planting more trees, which is great, wonderful, we like trees, but it's not a perfect solution. So the first step is always, what can we reduce? What can we stop emitting? And only after we've reduced what we can reduce do we think about how do we then start to develop our carbon capture technology and try and remove carbon from the atmosphere.
Yeah, okay, I've got you. And I'm a bit of a geek, and I like to look at the new technology that's coming to bear on removing carbon, and this is pretty cool. What's going on, but you're right, we are in very, very early stages. A lot of interesting stuff happening in Iceland with using the polar sinks that are available. Really good stuff. You can YouTube your way through hours and hours of fun in this area. But you're right. These are early days in terms of removing carbon. And we actually are in, we're a lot more advanced on creating green energy, non-carbon based energy. Still a long way to go, but we're definitely further advanced. So, from that starting point, what has the UK signed up for?
Yeah, so most countries the world over have signed up to this commitment to achieve this goal of net zero by 2050, based on an understanding that if we don't, we really are setting ourselves up for really damaging amounts of warming. We're talking areas of the Earth uninhabitable levels of warming. But what the UK has done at COP26 is go a little bit of a step further than this and say that we want to remove at least 68% of our emissions by 2030. So we're setting, the government has set a pretty mammoth goal of reducing by at least 68% by 2030 in order to put us on the right track, hopefully, to reach our net zero by 2050.
Okay, so 68% by 2030, that does sound big, knowing that where we start from. And I think one of the challenges with this, and let me say, one of the skepticisms that I have, or the skeptical part of me comes forward with this, is we haven't really seen a lot, right? There's, the question is, all right, we've made a commitment, but where's the action behind that? And how does that translate to society generally? I mean, we have obviously a whole commercial, we have personal, we have a whole commercial sector. We also have the government itself. I mean, the government represents 40%, probably more than that right now with pandemic spending. Probably 40 to 45% of total economic output is the government. So what is the government itself doing to measure and reduce, and how defined is that?
Yeah, so as you say, there have been a lot of commitments to reducing carbon dioxide and other emissions of greenhouse gases over the past several years. And a lot of them, to the despair of climate activists, have resulted in very little actual auditable action. And the hope is that this commitment is going to be different. That I'm willing to remain optimistic, but the UK government hasn't yet set out really clear guidelines to both to local government and to the rest of the public sector about how we are meant to put this into practice. So we know that as a society, we're aiming for net zero, but we don't really know what our roadmap to net zero is. We don't know, we know what the A is, we know what the B is, we don't know how to get from A to B. Okay,
and from my understanding, government has claimed that they set aside last year 1.2 billion for local government alone, but they, in fairness to them, they also quite immediately come out and say the reality is we need to ring fence funding. We need to make it clear for local government. We need to make sure that funding is available in the long term, right? It's not just a one-off. It's not just budgets being shifted around to really focus on that. So I think there is a real recognition from within government that it needs to be clear. There needs to be a real apparatus put in place, and it needs to be long term. But it isn't there today, and I think we need to recognize that. But that doesn't stop us from getting on with ourselves, right? Of taking the right action, becoming more aware, starting to make decisions right now, even if we don't have a framework in which to operate, or even a statutory responsibility. We all have personal responsibility in this area, and we certainly have organizational responsibility to do the right thing. So how do we go about achieving net zero?
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent point. And what we've been trying to do at CAN is try to develop internally our own best practice, right? To figure out how we as a company are taking our steps towards achieving net zero. Are we getting it all right? Definitely not. The aim here, the hope here is to try and to develop. So we've got kind of a three-pronged approach. The first part of it is quite simply understanding our impact, right? Measuring our emissions. How bad, quote unquote, is CAN in terms of the environment? Once we've got that idea, we can start to reduce those emissions, right? We can take some easy steps like switching to renewable energy, or we can take more holistic company-wide moves, build a server in the middle of Norfolk with solar panels on the roof, who knows? And once we've reduced everything that we can reduce, we can then consider, in order to really zero out our impact, offsetting things that can't be reduced. So we're hoping that by following that approach, we'll end up with a net zero company.
Okay. So I think it probably is, it's useful in this context as well, kind of to share a little bit about, how can kind of almost from a personal perspective, use this. So, one of the things that we did a few months ago is kind of take a step back and we asked everybody within CAN, what's important to you, right? What gets you up in the day, and what drives you outside of CAN, right? So what are those things that you want to put a stamp on, that maybe we collectively as CAN can have an impact on? And there were lots of things that came out from that, and we as CAN are thinking about that. But one thing that was universal for everybody in CAN was sustainability, was the environment, was what we're doing to have an impact. So, which is fantastic, so we're passionate about it. We want to do something at a personal level, and now we get to collectively as CAN try to do something at a company level as well. So that's great. We're our heads are in the right place. Hopefully our hearts are in the right place as well. So one of the things in terms of going through this process that we decided was it might be useful if everybody else can see the journey that we're on. Lots of other people are going to be thinking about this, worrying about it, wanting to do something about it. Maybe it'd be a really good idea to be open about it. Warts and all, we're going to make a lot of mistakes. We're going to be stupid, and I think being publicly stupid is not necessarily easy, but maybe it's that's useful, right? Because in going through that process of, here's what we're trying to do, here's where we're screwing up, and here's what we're doing to try to make that better. Maybe it can help others, right? It can certainly help our community of communicators in the public sector think about these kinds of activities, but it might also be able to help other companies that are like CAN, right? That are serving different sectors. They might be able to see what CAN is doing, and it might help them think about their own emissions, and it might help them develop plans, and it might help them be more involved than they are today. So, the starting point is that we want to do something about this, and we're out there, we're talking about it. This is kind of the start of us talking about it, in that process. Okay, so that's where we're starting from. These are the kinds of ways you can do this. So how is this measured? What is this whole measurement system about?
Yeah, so the first step is trying to develop an emissions monitoring system, or an EMS, which does exactly what it says on the tin. It allows you to monitor your emissions. So this can be quite a complex process, but it's really a system that once you set it up, it can run for years and years and give you an idea of your company footprint without too much additional effort. So a lot of initial outlay for a hopefully carbon-free future. So
yeah, there are a lot of people in CAN that have been grumbling about the media for a couple of weeks now. John Paul being one of them, but we won't go too much into detail on that right now.
I can imagine. So essentially what the EMS tries to do is measure the CO2 equivalent, the carbon dioxide equivalent, which I'll go into in a bit more detail later, emitted as a result of all company activities. So for us at CAN, we measure things like how bad is our travel, how much do we emit from taking the train, how much do we emit as a result of our homes being powered, and part of our time in our homes being spent working for CAN. But we also look into things like, there's someone on a computer somewhere in the UK viewing one of our ads. How much does that generate, right? How bad is that for the environment? But also, how does that ad getting to them generate emissions? So we're really digging into all the elements of our practice as a company, trying to figure out at every stage of our process, where is there potential for emissions to be generated? So it is a little bit of an interesting process. It does involve me asking John Paul and everybody else lots of questions about what electricity tariff they're on, how much they travel, and all those kinds of things. But once you have that data, and you can, how many emissions are generated as a result of one of those kinds of activities, you start to be able to build a really full picture of what the company emits as a whole.
Okay, and I can just tell by what you're saying, what's on the slide. This is pretty thorny, right? Some of this stuff is pretty obvious, right? It's pretty direct. How much, if I drive my car, right? How much emissions am I emitting on that basis? Some of this feels really indirect. Somebody looking at an ad, on a website somewhere, I don't even know where they are, right? And measuring that and understanding it, that's a lot more complex. So what are these levels, right? These different types of emissions, and how are they thought about and categorized? What are we going to be hearing about in terms of these different types of emissions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. I think one thing to flag up before I go into those kinds of emissions in more detail is that the most important thing to do in terms of reducing your impact on the environment is to start. So we have tried to measure our emissions. We've done a lot of guesswork, right? We've done a lot of kind of guesstimates of what are the impact of our ads, on the impact of our electricity tariffs, all these kinds of things. We probably haven't got it 100% right because it's very difficult to get it 100% right. But at the end of the day, even if we end up underestimating our emissions and still reducing them, we've taken a positive step. If we end up overestimating our emissions and reducing them, an even more positive step. So I think that the fear of failure, or the fear of not getting it completely right, can often be a little bit of a barrier in terms of trying to mitigate your climate impact, but it really shouldn't be, because the only negative action is inaction. I think any kind of attempt towards improvement is really, really positive. So on that note, I'm going to bring in a little bit more complexity on these categories of emissions. So as you said, Lloyd, this is a thorny area. We can subdivide our emissions into different areas, but there's overlap and they're quite confusing. So we'll go through them and try and get a bit more understanding. So your Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions from any operations that are controlled by the company. So that's, for example, if you're generating electricity, you would be responsible for the emissions as a result of that electricity generation. So those are any direct emissions, anything you as a company are directly responsible for. The other scopes are indirect emissions. So you've got Scope 2, which is your indirect emissions through the purchase of generated electricity, heat, anything like that. So if you're buying electricity to heat your home or buying electricity to heat your office, you're not directly responsible for those emissions. They're being emitted by the electricity company, but you are indirectly responsible, right? You are still choosing to demand electricity from that company rather than another. And then Scope 3 is all the other kinds of indirect emissions. So anything that is not related to the generation of heat, electricity, steam, etc., but which is still an indirect emission. So that's something like you choosing to fly to the States for a business trip, for example, or doing your commuting on the tube versus on a bicycle or on a bus or in a private car.
Okay. I think that's helpful. I'm still not 100% there, because I've still got to get in my head how different things fit into different categories. But I agree with you. It's something that we see a lot of, this concept of Scope 1, 2, and 3, and what you can control and what you can't control. I guess what's tugging at me a bit, bothering me a bit, is control, and some of the things that you were describing in Scope 3. I wonder whether we do have a little bit more control. So let me ask a question. Where do cloud services, right? Let me give that example. Where do cloud services fit into this?
Yeah, so cloud services, unless you are building and using your own server, which you control, right, which you power through a generator, or you have solar panels on the roof of, cloud services are going to be Scope 3. They are, in this handy little diagram published by DEFRA, their use of goods and services, right? So you're using the services of a cloud provider in order to provide your service. So it's a Scope 3 emission. Okay, got you.
And so what does DEFRA then say about what's its guidance about Scope 3? What should we be doing about Scope 3 as far as DEFRA is concerned?
Yeah, so DEFRA says that measuring our Scope 3 emissions is discretionary, right? You really should be measuring your Scope 1 and your Scope 2. but you don't necessarily need to measure your scope 3. And that aligns to some degree with the fact that scope 1 and 2 are a little bit easier to measure and a little bit easier to control, whereas scope 3 can be a little bit more nebulous, a bit harder to pin down. Discretionary, though, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be measuring them, right? And in particular, I know you and I have discussed this before, Lloyd, it's important to understand these emissions because we as consumers of those indirect services can have an effect on them, right? If we as consumers demand more renewable electricity, if we as consumers demand more cloud services that are powered by renewables, hopefully the supply will be there as well.
Oh, okay. Now, yeah, I'm that makes me feel a little bit better because even though DEFRA is saying we don't have an obligation to do this, the reality is we do have an obligation to do this, right? We have a greater level of control than scope 3 might otherwise suggest that we do. And I know that I saw a question pop up, I think it was from Anne, about where are the quick wins, what can you do? And I think Emilia, would you agree that generally speaking, scope 1 tends to be, because it's direct, you find more of your quick wins in the scope 1 area, and as you move down the scopes, you find less and less quick wins, and as you go down that chain. I think, and that's probably true, right? And that's a good kind of rule of thumb. But I think from Can's perspective, and I think cloud services are a really good example, and I'll give a really specific one. For part of our infrastructure in terms of our ad delivery, we use AWS, Amazon Web Services. Now, unlike Google, I think you mentioned before, AWS is mixed, right? Some of their server farms are renewable, some of their server farms are not renewable. And we happen to be in a server farm near London that is not renewable. In fact, there is no server farm that AWS operates in the UK that is renewable. The closest one is Ireland, right? So one of the things that we're looking at is shifting our server capacity within AWS from the UK to Ireland. Right, that'll have a latency effect, right? So how quickly ads load and what that means for it, and therefore have an effect on our campaign. So we're going through that process of measuring that to say, can we make this shift? If we make this shift, what impact will it have on the campaign itself and the ability to deliver that campaign? But what positive impact will it now have on carbon emissions? But we can control that. We can, set those parameters. And it's not just AWS. We also are looking at, are there alternative suppliers who have server farms in the UK, which are renewable, which means we can have our cake and eat it too, right? We can hit that, move closer to the net negative, deal with the negative emissions from those cloud-based services while having zero latency. So it's scope 3. So coming back to Anne's question, that might be a really big, might have a really big impact, and it becomes a supply chain decision, right? Understanding it, analyzing it's hard, but it could have a big impact in terms of our emissions as a company, maybe bigger than some of our scope 1 areas that we really do have direct control over, but are piecemeal. They're smaller amounts. So there's no easy answer to where the low-hanging fruit is, and it'll be different for everyone. But that's the kind of thinking that we're going through, and definitely for us, scope 3 is inbound. We're focused on it. We want to have control over it, even as much control over it as we possibly can.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something that we're spending a lot of our time and energy on, because actually our scope 3 emissions, particularly from cloud services, are around 98% of our carbon footprint. So we're a little bit atypical in that regard, right? Not every company will spend quite that much carbon-wise on placing ads in different places. So for a lot of people, those scope 1 and scope 2 emissions will provide a lot more opportunity for reduction. But for Can, certainly, if we don't think about reducing those scope 3 emissions, we're going to really struggle to reach our net zero goal.
Okay, great. So now let's kind of translate that into what is this actually practically, right? So we're talking somewhat esoterically about emissions, et cetera, et cetera. can we bring that down into something that is a little more tangible, a little bit easier to put into a kind of a mental frame of mind?
Yeah, definitely. And this is one of the big issues with trying to mitigate impact on the environment, right? Which is just trying to understand how quote unquote bad you are, right? So you can measure your footprint, but putting that into context is quite difficult. So to start with, I'm just going to go ahead and define this term that we've been using quite a lot, which is carbon dioxide equivalent, which some people may not have heard of yet. So carbon dioxide equivalent is just a standard unit which measures the other kinds of greenhouse gases in terms of the amount of CO2 that would produce the equivalent amount of global warming. So all it's trying to do is make a summary measure which is more comparable, which takes into account all greenhouse gases, not just CO2. And the reason that's super important is because, as you can see on the statistic on the slide, in 2009, the UK emitted around 474 million tons of CO2, just carbon dioxide. But on a carbon dioxide equivalent measure, emitted closer to 570 million tons. So quite a lot of the UK's emissions, quite a lot of any individual company's emissions as well, is going to be these other gases, these other greenhouse gases, which aren't just CO2. So it's important to move away from just a plain CO2 measure.
Yeah, and we know that one of those big ones is methane. And I think one of the COP26 silver linings was that methane was at least the greenhouse gas that we got a lot of commitments around in terms of reducing, and that's as you say, that's about 20% of the total, and with the lion's share of that coming from methane, that's important stuff. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really important to think about, and we're lucky that we do have this calculator which gives us CO2e as a nice standard measure. Obviously, that doesn't clear up what a good amount of CO2e is to emit. So on our latest 2020 EMS, our emissions at Cannes are somewhere around 306 tons of CO2e per year, which is compared to an average in the advertising industry as a whole of around 641 tons. So we're not terrible. We're a good bit below average. That doesn't mean that we're good because the average is probably quite high, but we're not doing too badly.
Okay, so on the spectrum, we look good, but the reality is the spectrum is a bit crap because any emission is adding to the problem that we in the world have. Yeah, we might want to pat ourselves on the back, but that would be unwise to do so. And I think you've kind of translated this into something that's even more tangible, that gives us a real idea of what even our 300 tons, what kind of impact that has.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's quite hard to measure, what does 1 ton of carbon do to the planet in terms of warming, simply because of this cumulative effect that we spoke about before. But we know that we can talk about the impact of CO2 more in terms of offsetting. So 1 ton of CO2 would take 50 trees 1 year to remove from the atmosphere, which means that for Cannes' entire carbon footprint for 1 year, we'd need around 15,000 trees to be planted and to live out their lifetimes in order to capture that amount of carbon.
Wow. Okay. That does put it into context. Little old Cannes, who supposedly is on the good end of the spectrum, is itself needing 15,000 trees. And I think you and I talked earlier that there are 20,000 new trees planted in the new forest each year. So that amount of trees would just be for Cannes to be able to offset its carbon emissions from 1 year. All right, so that does kind of put it into context, and we ain't very big, right? So that's even more important, but it just emphasizes, makes even more of an emphasis on don't emit in the first place, right? So the more we can do on the don't emit side, the less we have to do on the removal side, and we really need to focus there, even though we know we'll never get there completely. But our attention really needs to be on that don't emit end of the spectrum.
Exactly. We just at the moment don't have a good way of removing carbon from the atmosphere. We can offset by buying trees, and there's many offsetting schemes out there that will say, give us £10 and we'll plant 10 trees for you, and you can sleep a little bit more easily at night. But it's not a perfect solution. In fact, in many cases, it's a very imperfect solution. So step one always has to be, don't emit the stuff in the first place, to as much as you can. And then step two can be find a responsible offsetting solution to get rid of the rest of your emissions. But we simply don't have enough land mass as a world to be able to just plant trees to offset all our carbon emissions.
Okay, no, Paul's going to start to tug on us a bit now, because we are using a lot of time here, and so we probably should speed it up. Go through a little bit of what we've done with our EMS, process, and kind of what we then do about it. I will say very briefly, because I can't remember if we come to this or not later, that we're not only looking at the digital side. CAN does engage in non-digital advertising as well. It's a fairly small portion of the portfolio, but we do out of home. We do some print, etc. There's a bit of radio here and there. So there are those elements, and we haven't done it yet, but we will focus on the measurements of those elements as well. Not so much for CAN, but for our communicator community, because we know that local government generally does use different the portfolio more broadly than just CAN does, and we want everybody to be able to measure the impact of, for instance, doing a leaflet drop. What does that mean? What kind of emissions are associated with that? So that all of the people in our kind of world, in our environment, are able to make those calculations, are able to include that the carbon variable into what they do with campaigns. I know that John Paul's going to, if we allow him to today and not use up all the time, is going to talk a bit more about that as well.
All right, I'll barrel through our process then nice and quickly. So step one in the process was selecting our base year, which we discussed a little bit already. We chose 2020 because this is the year that we're going to be comparing our emissions to in future. So when we reduce, we're reducing against the benchmark of our 2020 emissions. We then went back, looked through our calendars, recorded all our emissions generating activities in 2020. We also summarized all the ads we ran in 2020 and all the ads we placed in 2020. So we could interrogate those emissions as well. What we did then was try to gather some data, right? And the data we gathered was on what is the emission per unit of each of those activities. So we know that Lloyd's car will emit around 0.3 kilograms of CO2e per mile. So if Lloyd drove 100 miles in 2020, that gives us a pretty good idea of what the emissions from that activity were. But that data is also out there for different modes of transport, right? You can calculate it for an EV, you can calculate it for trains, flights, etc. So summing all of that data together gives us this idea of our approximately 300 tons of CO2e carbon footprint. And there's a whistle-stop tour of our EMS.
Okay, good. And I think, as I say, most people on this webinar are not going to be responsible for the measurement process itself. I just think it's important to give that context. Okay, so I think we're close, Emilia, to wrapping up then and handing this over. Paul is nudging me now, most directly, so we better wrap it up. Any final thoughts and comments before we do that?
Sorry, I lost my mute button for a second there. No, not really. I think the main thing is to say that, this is just the first step. So we've got this data now. We're now starting to think about what do we do about it. And in terms of what we're doing about it, we're implementing a carbon reduction plan. So we're setting out our own personal step-by-step roadmap between now and whenever we achieve net zero to understand how we're going to get there. And we're going to continue to share that journey as we create that plan and as we follow it. Basically, because we're going to do some things right and some things wrong, and we want to share the things that we do right and be audited on things we do wrong. So we're hoping to be able to share a lot more, maybe not best practice, but a lot more practice with the industry at large as we continue through the process.
Okay, cool. And we will create calculators that others can use, that our communications colleagues can use in their environments as they're looking at their campaigns, but even other companies can use if they want to, and hopefully everybody pulling in the right direction. So we'll probably do a wrap there. Paul, apologies for that. John Paul, very many apologies for that, stealing a lot of your time. Hope you're able to get through everything now.
Just before JP jumps in, just thanks for that, you two. I know Emilia has a background at Oxbridge, and it just feels to me like that's one of the most intense tutorials around climate change that I've sat through for whatever, I think, since this subject became an issue. So thanks for that. A couple of things just strike me, just leading into JP's final few words. One is that there are no clear guidelines. So this is a classic situation where we've all got these ambitions, particularly government, but as yet we don't know how we're going to move to that. But what I liked about what you were both saying is that it's both a personal responsibility and an organisational responsibility. And we know local government in particular has met that responsibility in the sense of their local commitments to a whole range of targets, etc. So inevitably, local government is going to lead this, even though it might appear that government wants to lead it too. But all answers are local, I think, from that point of view. The second thing that strikes me is that as communicators, we can't get away from saying, well, it's all digital now. This is Paul Masterman being very stupid, but of course, digital costs because of the energy that is being spent by those huge servers around the world, etc., etc. So it's not just about going digital, it's about being cleverer about how we approach things. And third thing that strikes me is this is hugely complicated. I think you probably lost me on slide 2, if I'm honest with you. As somebody who, to coin a phrase, went to a bog standard comprehensive. But thank God that we've got people like you two who can just take us through some thinking and allow us to learn from your experience right in the middle of the same marketplace that we're all in ourselves. So John Paul, what do we need to do next?
Well, that's the thing. You've got people looking at what is out there. And when we started looking at calculators and things like that, a lot of alarm bells went off. There are issues like double counting, there are all these sort of things. And we know how complex your jobs are, the number of different clients you have. So I think it's our role to do what Lloyd and Emilia are doing and giving ourselves a firm foundation, but then giving quick shortcuts that we can apply every day in the context of communication. The reason we went ahead before we had these calculators is because we're moving to the next financial year. There's planning going on, and this thinking needs to be embedded or at least considered now. And so I've done some work with Lloyd and Emilia on what that might look like. So basically it's going to go through applying the principles that Emilia has spoken about and Lloyd has spoken about to comms, actions that we can take as communicators when we're planning campaigns, but also actions critically in terms of conversations we can have with our commissioners. Just hold one thing in your mind. It's that old adage from recycling. We need to reduce, we need to be cleverer with resources, and we need to renew and recycle as much as possible. So just to reiterate what Emilia was saying, when we're thinking about a plan, we need to think, how can we mitigate carbon emitted? And that can be from things like print and things going around in vans, but also around a video will create more carbon than a black static image with white ones. So there's lots of things that we can do around mitigation. Then we need to think about optimization. That's about getting better at targeting, getting better at how we deliver things. And only when we've done those things as much as possible do we get into offsetting. Really quickly on mitigation, reduce wastage. Don't spend energy speaking to people that can't achieve the outcome that you're trying to so that's zooming in on the people you need to speak to. If you do that, automatically the opportunity for energy wastage or carbon release is reduced significantly. do some analysis of the channels, and we're going to be doing this for you, but for example, we talked about AWS. Google is very good. They are a net negative company, so we might prioritize Google channels over maybe others that are maybe slightly more obscure, and consider low carbon design. We're working a lot on this with 22 Design at the moment around what principles we can apply when we're creating a suite of creatives for a campaign that will reduce the energy consumed by that campaign being delivered. As you run a campaign, you cut the things that aren't working, and you're quite ruthless about that. That will obviously increase outcomes from your resources as well. And also think about, when I run a campaign, is there something in this campaign that could be used for something in the future? So a bit like, getting rid of a car to get an electric car actually produces more car. Are there things that you can keep using for a longer period that will make things more efficient in the future? And then, as a last resort, look at offsetting. So estimate, measure as best as possible, work out ways to capture, and ideally make it local. And this is another thing that we're working on with 22 Design. They work a lot with the Forestry Commission, and what we're trying to build, and we may not get there this year, we may not get there next year, is a way of reliably offsetting communications campaigns locally by partnering with the Forestry Commission. So at least when you're offsetting, that impact is happening in the region that you look after. You've got a brief come in for a plan. What do you do when you're looking at that brief? Well, really zoom in on who is the target audience. Is it clear? Don't just do something based on budget or based on a requirement to have something done on a date. Who's the target audience? Remember that doing nothing is okay sometimes. It might be that something, just pushing something out, just saying something without a measurement, without target audience, you could save a lot of energy by not doing that. And it's sometimes a useful challenge. Prioritize your lower carbon channels first, and that's something we need to help you with. Again, that idea of storing audiences and reusing them and reusing information, and maybe think, when you're speaking about one campaign, could we also put a secondary and a tertiary message in for other things that are relevant to that audience? So have piggybacking on campaigns, multiple outcomes from communications. And even think about, can I make this in a black background so it uses less screen energy, less video, and so on. Using video just in remarketing could be other things that we use as well. So that idea, just mitigate and optimize. Now, when you're speaking to the person who's given you the brief, carbon might be a useful context to get to things that you've maybe trying to get at for years. But have we considered the carbon emissions? They might come to comms because they think comms can design a leaflet and the leaflet will go to everyone. That question might make them question whether they go down the leaflet route. I think using a concept from carbon around wastage, could that help you get the client to think better about targeting? Going back to, what's the outcome for your campaign? How many people do we need to actually do that? So how are we more effective in how we deliver it? This is a question you could ask outside of the world of carbon, but it also has an impact on carbon released by communications. And then think about the calls to action. Are we asking people in our communications to do things that will be through the most carbon optimal route? Be that online, be that through anywhere. So think about the calls to action. Are they going to reduce carbon emissions to the atmosphere as well? So hopefully those conversations, those actions could lead to not just reduction in carbon, which is something we want to and must try to get to, but could it mean that we deliver better campaign performance overall? And we like to think yes. Sometimes when you're trying to sell something, the pertinence, the relevance of that subject to the person we're speaking to may not be as passionate about it as we are. But something we can definitely all agree on is that campaigns that work better are good for everyone. And so talking about carbon, talking about waste may be better than talking about ROI, cost per click, cost per outcome, and so on. So it should be hopefully a useful tool that helps us build better campaigns. And I think if that happens, then we can really build it into everything we do. So those are my sort of shortcuts and heuristics, which you can hopefully use. Paul.
Good. Well, the nature of this session has been about starting our conversation, and I'm sure all of us have got about 50,000 questions that we could spend the rest of the afternoon discussing with our colleagues, but we've all got busy lives, so we won't do that. But I haven't given colleagues any warning of this, but perhaps JP, you could, if I'm a hard-pressed head of communications turning up at work on Monday morning, what is the one thing that I should start doing? And while you're thinking about that, for Lloyd and Emilia, you've obviously done a lot of thinking around how this impacts on working life at Cannes. What is the one mistake you made in the early days of thinking about this, or is it still too early to have made any mistakes? So JP, the one thing I should do as head of communications when I turn up on Monday morning?
Reduce wastage. Cut the things that don't work.
Good. And Lloyd, Emilia, what was the hard lessons you've been learning around this in the early days?
Well, I think I'll let Emilia chime in, but I think it's a. I honestly thought it was going to be easier. I thought it wasn't going to be as challenging as it is, but at the same time, and I think Emilia drove this point home really well. That can't be an excuse not for doing it, right? So we got a long way to go to understand our supply chain. That 98%, we really have to get after that. It's going to take a lot of work for us to do it and unravel it. I never imagined, it would be as hard as it is to be able to do that. And we're going to have to make some hard decisions about cutting people out who might perform well, but on balance, that performance relative to the carbon output just doesn't work. And so we're going to have to do that. I honestly didn't think we would be confronted with that kind of decision-making process as part of this. So it's been an eye-opener for me.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo. I think the main mistake is just not starting sooner. Because as I say, the main thing to do on this is to get going, to get moving, to get that momentum building. So we could always have started this 3 years ago. But hindsight's 2020, and it's good that we're working on it now. But I think I would echo Lloyd with saying that Cannes is a pretty sustainable business on the surface. People work from home. A lot of the employees have renewable electricity tariffs. We're doing pretty well. But then if you dig in under the surface to those Scope 3 emissions, it's a minefield. And it's that really interrogating, really understanding our supply chain, which is the biggest hurdle, I think, for us.
Brilliant. Can I just thank the three of you for giving us such a lot of food for thought. I know all three of you are very willing to take questions at any point over the next few weeks or months and years. It's very easy to track you three down. We know where you live. But thanks for doing some of that initial thinking, and I think there's a lot to talk about from now on in. For us, I think Anne has flagged up in the comment that this is a conversation, as we said, and let's get some of our colleagues around this virtual table into that conversation pretty damn quick, so we can push this forward from as early as next week. So thanks for that. That's the formal end of our webinar. But for those who were able to join us right at the beginning, we did promise, or John Paul has promised, a little sort of interesting, whizzy, free gift for you to have a look at. So please rush off if you've got things to go to. But if you've got another 10 minutes, I'm going to hand back to John Paul.
Thank you, Paul. So in the spirit of trying things that improve experience, improve performance whilst reducing carbon, we've all had more Teams and Zoom meetings than I think we ever thought we would. And we were very interested to see our friends at Create 42 who've come up with this new piece of technology. And we think there's two potential applications. one for engaging citizens in a much richer way than a web page or a Facebook post, and also for the way we engage together. As we go back to being allowed to be together in person, we must consider whether that's definitely the right way to go about it, not just from a carbon point of view, but also from an exclusion point of view. People who maybe find travel more of a challenge than others have quite enjoyed being able to connect with everything. So how we look at hybrid events, how we include people, how we deliver events that have massive impact with much smaller amounts of carbon emitted is key. So in that context, what we're going to have to do, I'm popping a link into the chat now, and you'll need to click on that link and then leave this meeting. So yeah, click on the link, open it in your browser, and then hit leave on the Teams meeting, and I will see you there.